All right, so let's continue our lectures on metaphysics. In the last couple of lectures, we talked about ontological categories and ontological relations. I mean, I didn't really talk about them specifically, but we saw a couple of them. In this lecture, we will dive a little bit deeper into these relations, list them properly, and then talk about them a little bit. So, by ontological relations, what we mean is the relations that exist between the formal relations that exist between formal ontological categories of kinds, properties, objects, and modes. Also, along with identity, for instance, constitution, that we have seen before. So we have identity, instantiation, characterization, exemplification. These we have seen in the beginning of our lectures. We also saw constitution, which was different from identity. There are other ontological relations, for instance, composition and also ontological dependence, which I will talk about today, and I will also give some examples of ontological dependence in terms of rigid dependence, non-rigid dependence, and identity dependence. I will explain what they mean. So I won't talk about identity, instantiation, characterization, exemplification. These are we already talked about. Also constitution. Constitution I will talk a little bit more. So let's start with dependence. So by ontological dependence, the name suggests when you have two things and one of them depends on another one. But ontological dependence is not just one kind of dependence. It's a family of different dependence that can happen. I give here three examples. One is an ontological rigid dependence, existential rigid dependence, which means that X depends on Y rigidly if and only if necessarily X exists only if Y exists. So X exists only if Y exists. So the existence of Y is necessary for the existence of X. In that sense, we say that X depends rigidly on Y. For instance, a trope or a mode depends on the object that is the mode of, rigidly. In a sense that when you have, for instance, you have a ball and then that ball is round, the roundness, the way that ball is, depends rigidly on the ball. In a sense that if that ball goes out of existence, then its roundness, the roundness of that ball doesn't linger around. It doesn't float around. It will also go out of existence. If I'm speaking right now, that's a mode that I have. If I go out of existence right now, my talking cannot just linger around, cannot float around without me. My talking depends on me for its existence. If I don't exist, then my talking also wouldn't exist. In the same sense about Aristotle and his life, the life of Aristotle depends on Aristotle to exist. If there is no Aristotle, then there is no Aristotle's life as an event. But also vice versa. If Aristotle's life doesn't exist, then also Aristotle wouldn't exist, because Aristotle, if it exists, it will always happen within a life, because Aristotle is a living being. So if his life doesn't exist, then Aristotle also wouldn't exist. So the dependence relation can be sometimes also symmetric. So that's rigid dependence, when one thing depends on another one, in a sense that if that one doesn't exist, then the other one wouldn't exist. Then we have non-rigid, non-rigidly. I made a mistake there. That's when for some kind f, the y's that are x depends on y. For some f, the y's are f's, and x exists only if there is something z such that z is an f. It looks complicated, but the idea is very simple. So instead of x depending on y, x depends on a kinds of things, f. So if any of those kinds of things exist, and if it depends on not that particular thing, but any of those kinds, then that's dependence in a non-rigid way. For instance, human being, our body, versus the cells of our body. So the existence of our body depends on the existence of the cells that make up our body. If you remove all of our cells out of existence right now, our body would go out of existence right now. But that doesn't mean that our body depends on these particular cells that are making up my body right now, because they can change, and we know that. So it's not this particular cell, it's just a cell. So any collection of cells could make up this body. But nonetheless, we do depend on cells. So that's a kind of non-rigid dependence. Universal versus particular also, in the sense that universal, if you remember, we were a fan of immanent realism. So not in the sense that universals exist independently of particulars. Immanent realism means that universals non-rigidly depend on particulars. The kind dog, the natural kind dog as a universal, exists only if there is a kind, there is a particular dog. So as long as there are particular dogs, we can talk about the universal kind dog. If you have a universal that just doesn't have any instance, then that basically means that that universal doesn't exist either. That's the immanent realism. So it's not like that they are floating around in a kind of Platonic form. In that sense, they would be independent, but in immanent realism, universal depends rigidly on particular. It doesn't depend on those particular dogs. It could have been any other dog, but it just there must be a dog. It must have had kind of an instance to exist. Another type of ontological dependence that we can talk about is identity dependence. That's when the identity of an object depends on something else. Now, if you remember, we define object as something that has a determinate identity condition. So it means that any object that we have has an identity. But if your identity depends on the identity of something else, then that means that we don't know what X is unless we know what Y is. So for example, trope and the object again. The my talking right now, which is a mode that I have, you wouldn't be able to identify my talking without knowing me. So the identity of my talking depends on the identity of me. Or a set and its members. If you have a set, the identity of that set, like which set are we talking about, depends on the identity of its members. If you have two sets, X and Y, and we want to check whether they're identical or not, how do we check that? We have to check the members, because the identity of the set depends on the identity of the members. And we can show that the identity dependence implies rigidly existential dependence. Because again, each object has to have a determinate identity, but if your identity depends on something else, then if that thing goes out of existence, then you lose your identity as well. So if you have a set and you remove one of its members and one of its members goes out of existence, then you lose the identity of that set. That set cannot exist anymore, because that set can only have its identity or keep its identity if it has all the members that it used to have. If you remove one of them, that set is destroyed. We might have a new set, but the previous set is gone. So if the identity depends on X depends on Y, then existentially also X depends on Y. So these are different types of ontological dependence. Based on these, what we can define a substance. A substance, we define a particular object that is ontologically independent in its identity. Now sometimes, this was a complication that I didn't introduce in the beginning. When we were talking about the ontological category of objects, we could have just said substances, But that's not technically true if you want to be accurate. Not all objects are substances. For instance, a set, again, is an object, is an abstract object. It has a determinate identity, but its identity depends on the identity of the elements. So it's not existentially independent. That's the main idea behind a substance. A substance is something that it can stand on its own. It can go through changes, it can lose some of its maybe parts, go through some change, but it remains what it is nonetheless. So if its identity depends on something else, then it means it existentially depends on something else, and it wouldn't be a substance. So that's why we define substance a particular that is ontologically independent in its identity. So if the identity is independent, we call that a substance. So a set is not a substance, but a chair is a substance. So that's for dependence. Next, we have composition. Composition classically is called mereology. That's the relation between the whole and part. A couple of principles and conclusions and definitions I will give here based on classical mereology. So composition, again, as we said, is the ontological relation that exists between a whole and its parts. For instance, a chair and the leg. So what's the definition of proper parthood? So this symbol, that's the proper parthood relation. So X is a proper part of Y. We should with this symbol. So we define a couple of axioms that defines what we mean by parthood. So X is a proper part of Y implies that Y is not a proper part of X. So the relation is not symmetric. If X is a proper part of Y and Y is a proper part of Z, then X is a proper part of Z. So the relation is transitive. And if X is a proper part of Y, then this implies that there exists a Z that is a proper part of Y, and Z is disjoint from X. Now we'll explain what this means. This principle is called the weak supplementation principle, WSP. So intuitively, it means that if you have something and then you say a proper part is a part that is not identical to the whole thing. So you have to put aside something of that whole to get to that proper part. So that third principle basically says that if you have a proper part, that there is something remaining disjoint from that proper part, which would make the whole thing. So by disjoint, we mean that there is no common part. So this symbol means a common part. So there is no common part. This is the not. And by common part, we mean when a Z exists, that Z is a part of X and Z is a part of Y. That's the common part. And by part, we define part based on identity and proper part. So we say X is a part of Y if either X is a proper part of Y or X is identical to Y. That's the definition. So based on these three definitions, we can understand this principle. That if X is a part of Y, then there exists some proper part of Y that is disjoint from X, that there's no common part or intersection between Z and X. That's WSP. Then we have the proper part principle, which states that if we have an X that is composite, which means that if we have an X that there exists some Z which is a proper part of X, that means that X is composite. It has proper parts. And for all Z, that is for all parts of all proper parts of X, then Z is also proper of Y. If this holds, that this implies that X is a part of Y. If X is a composite object and all the proper parts of X are also proper parts of Y, then X is a part of Y. And if you switch around, of course, again, if Y is a composite and all parts of Y are proper parts of X, then Y is a part of X. Which means that if they both hold, the left side of both of these proper parts principles hold, that is, if we have a composite object Y and we have a composite object X, and for all proper parts of but for all proper parts of Y, there are also proper parts of X, and for all proper parts of X, there are also proper parts of Y, then this implies that these two are equal to each other. This follows from these two principal proper parts, because if they both hold, then that means X is a part of Y, Y is a part of X. Part means either identical or proper part. Proper part is not symmetric. So if x is a part of y and y is a part of x, then that means that they're both improper parts of each other, or in other words, they're identical to each other. This is called the weak extensional principle. If you have two composite objects that have identical proper parts, then they're identical to each other. This comes from mereology. So that's also an ontological relation that can exist between parts and wholes. We also talked about constitution, another ontological relation. A constitution basically is the closest two things can get to identity relation. They're very close to each other, but they're not identity. When two things coincide with each other, we're talking about constitution. When two things coincide and one gets properties in virtue of the other one. So for instance, when we say that a clay statue is constituted by a lump of clay, what we mean is that it has the position, the weight, the physical properties of the clay by virtue of being constituted by that lump of clay. And note that we don't say they're identical with each other, because as we explained the first couple of lectures, constitution is not identity. That's why they're very close to each other, but they're not the same thing. It's a in virtue of something else kind of relation. Okay, so we talked about composition. Yes, we talked about dependence, composition, and constitution. Now, there can be some tension between these different principles. Because on the one hand, we have that constitution is not identity. We want to have the weak supplementation principle, which we can say any proper part has a complement, in simple terms. And weak extensional principle, that two composite with identical proper parts are identical with each other. Now, they can create some tension. Let's first see a case that they don't, but then we will see how it will generate a tension. Imagine that we have a statue constituted by clay, by a lump of clay. Here there is no tension between the constitution, WEP, and WSP. Why? Because, you see, so the idea is that on the one side we have this rules from mereology, like the weak extensional principle, that says if they have identical proper parts, that they have to be identical to each other. And then we have constitution that is very close to identity. They're almost overlapping each other, two things. But they're not identical to each other. So the question is, will there be a tension between these two principles? Can we identify a proper part in one of them that is not a proper part of the other one? So when we say that a statue is constituted by clay, we can do this because there's no tension here, because we can say that the statue has proper parts that are not proper parts of the clay, so that they don't have the same proper parts. For instance, the head. The head of the statue is a proper part of the statue of a human being, but it's not a proper part of a lump of clay. It's very weird to say that a lump of clay has a head. It doesn't have a head. The statue can have a head, but a lump of clay cannot have a head. But we can also provide a proof why it is it that that head is not. Why is that head is not a proper part of the clay? Suppose for reductio that H is a proper part of C. C is the clay, H stands for the head. C is the lump of clay that constitutes the whole statue. Now, if head is a proper part of C, start removing away clay slowly from other parts of the statue. H is still a part of what remains. So if you're saying that head is a proper part of clay, if I start cutting parts of clay from the legs, for instance, of this statue, whatever remains should also include head still as a proper part. I mean, it would be very weird that we say that head is a proper part of the clay, and then you remove a small part of its leg, and then you say, okay, now you remove that part. No, if it's a head, then it's a head. It's that part. It's on top of that statue. So if I start removing away clay slowly from other parts of the statue, H is still part of what remains. Now the idea is that we can keep doing this slowly, like moving away clay until only CH remains, and CH is the clay part that constitutes H. So you just remove it, you go up until neck, and then you also remove the neck until a part that you say, okay, now I can say that this is the head, and what the clay that remains is CH. Now, as we said, since we're doing this slowly and doing it very slowly, maybe one atom at a time, we're doing this in a continuous form. It would be extremely strange to say that up to a certain atom head was a part of CH, but the moment that you remove that next atom, then it's no longer a part of CH. That doesn't make any sense. So even if we go to the CH, we should still claim that H is a part of CH, is a continuous function here. So H should be a part of CH. But the problem is that H cannot be an improper part of CH, that is, it cannot be identical to it. Because H is neither identical to CH, because as we said, CH is the clay part that constitutes H, and constitution is not identity. H cannot be a proper part, because there are no proper parts of CH that are not proper parts of H. This comes from Weak supplementation principle. If H is a proper part of CH, then there must be a part of CH distinct from the head. But they coincide exactly. So there's no part of the clay that is not part of the head. I mean, when we removed everything and now we only have that head part. So it cannot be an improper part and it cannot be a proper part. And so this is a contradiction, right? Because for reductive, we assume that H is a proper part of C. So when we come here, we realize that H cannot be a proper part, because there are no other proper part of CH that are not part of H. And this concludes that the H is not a proper part of C. Now, there's of course one critical assumption here, that H is not identical with CH. Now, this is not begging the question, because what we're basically saying is that there is no tension between constitution and composition mereology, because when we have a statue and a lump of clay, the statue can have a proper part that is not a proper part of clay, and within that argument, we use the constitution and identity of some proper part of that statue, for instance, the head. Now, that's not a problem, so it's not begging the question. We're talking about two different things here. There's no tension here, but of course, one can ask about that assumption. Like, how do we, okay, you say that H is not identical with CH, right? The whole argument that we provided here was that we say that the constitution is not identity, because one of them has proper parts that the other one does not have. You see, so we're trying to bring together the mereology and the constitution ontological relation. And by doing this, and using this assumption, we can prove that the statue is not identical. It's constituted by the clay, but it's not identical to it. But someone can say, okay, let's go for this one. How do you prove that head is constituted by CH? Then obviously we can do the same argument for the head and then use other anatomical parts such as eyes or ears. We can again say, okay, the head is not identical to the lump of clay that constitutes the head, because the head has an eye, but the lump of clay doesn't have an eye. So mereology wouldn't tell us, weak extensional wouldn't tell us that these two are identical to each other. Then one said, okay, then repeat that and keep doing that. Then of course we cannot go forever, right? In the end, we will have to end up with simple anatomical parts. We will end up with a part. You might go to the ear, and then you remove that part of lobe, and then that part, and then that part, until you get to somewhere a bridge on a part of your ear that you say that's based on the anatomy of a human being. It doesn't has any other part. It's just a simple anatomical part. What then? What happens then? And there we will face a problem, because now that argument that we had wouldn't work, right? Because that argument works based on finding some proper part, some anatomical proper part of that thing that we want to show that is constituted but it's not identical. But here we face a challenge. So we have a tension here now, and the tension is between, on the one hand, constitution is not identity, WSP, WEP, and A is an anatomical symbol constituted by CA. That's the lump of clay constituting the A. So I'm calling that A. I mean, we can have an ear, for instance, but let's call it A. And there's a tension because first, A doesn't have any other anatomical parts. Before that, we said, okay, let's say the statue, of course, we say it's a composite thing. So any part of the clay is also a part of the statue. And then if all the proper parts of the statue are also proper parts of the clay, then they would be identical by WEP, but we don't want to say that they're identical to each other. But now we have a simple A that doesn't have any other anatomical parts, so it seems that the only proper parts that it would have are the parts of the clay. And all the parts of the clay are the proper parts of that A, and they should be identical to each other. So the tension is that A doesn't have any anatomical parts. The improper part of CA cannot be a proper part of A, right? So the whole of CA cannot be a proper part of A because of Wick's supplementational principle. Because if CA is a proper part of A, that means that A has a proper part that is disjoint from CA. But if you have a simple anatomical part, what proper part of that CA, of that A, is not a proper part of the clay? It doesn't have anything, right? It doesn't have any anatomical part that is not a proper part. It doesn't have a head to say that, okay, it doesn't. The head is not a proper part of that clay. It doesn't have any of those parts. So the improper part of CA cannot be a proper part of A. The proper parts of CA cannot be a proper part of A, because again, A doesn't have any other anatomical parts, and if the only proper parts that remain are the proper parts of the clay, and if the proper parts of the clay are the proper parts of A, then the A and CA would be identical by Wick extensional principle. But then what should we say here? If you were to say that A is a composite, has proper parts, what's the relation between proper parts of the A and the proper parts of CA? There are different ways that people try to get rid of this tension. Some said, okay, the problem comes from the fact that we think constitution is not identity. Harold Noonan has a paper called Constitution is Identity. So he says that, no, you see, we have to say that constitution is identity. So the A and CA, the ear and the clay of the ear, the head and the clay, and the statue and the clay, they are identical to each other. It's not a constitution. E.J. Lowe says that we have to put aside Wick's supplementation principle. That is, when you have a proper part, then you have a proper part disjoint from that. David Hirshenhoff says that we have to put aside Wick extensional principle. That is, even though you might have this A and CA who have exactly the same identical proper parts, yet we have to say that they're not identical to each other because they want to keep the constitution is not identity. But note that each one of these three is a very high price to pay. Constitution is not identity. We have very good arguments in defense of why constitution is not identity. Think about all the identity conditions and the changes that they can go through. Wick's supplementation principle also is a classic Mariology, and some believe it's so strong that it's just an analytic. I guess it's Peter Simons in his book Part says that if we don't accept the Wick's supplementation principle, we just don't know what we're talking about by proper part. I mean, that's what it means to be a proper part. If you say I have a proper part, it means that there is something left of that whole that is not in that proper part, and that's Wick's supplementation principle. But E.J. Lowe says that maybe we should put that aside. Wick extensional is also a difficult one. As we saw, it clearly comes from the principle of proper parts, so it's not very easy to put that one also aside. So all three are very expensive options, but we have to do something here. I mean, otherwise we're reaching a contradiction which is infinitely more costly for us. But actually there is one more part, there's one more option here that I'm going to suggest, which is also a suggestion based on works of Lowe, who said that we have to put aside Wick's supplementation principle before he puts away WSP. So Lowe changes his mind near the end of his life, in 2013, he changes his mind on WSP. But before he changed his mind, when he used to believe in WSP, he had an argument very similar to what we have here, which he called the simplicity argument. And the conclusion of that argument was that the way that we have to resolve this contradiction, in other words, this would be an argument for the simplicity of that substance that we're talking about. Now there he's talking about another substance that we will get to in next lecture, but the idea here is that we can also say the same thing about this simple anatomical part A. Because note that all of these propositions, they come into contact because A doesn't have any other anatomical parts. The improper part of CA cannot be a proper part. The proper part cannot be a proper part. Okay, maybe the whole problem is that we assume that A has a proper part. Maybe that's a problem. A is not a composite thing. It doesn't have any proper part. The idea is that it's a little bit, looks counterintuitive. As I said, there is a cost to pay here, but I believe that this is the lowest cost that we can pay comparing to the other options. And in the next slide, I will explain a little bit, but maybe a little bit of historical background on this thing, because I guess it's interesting about, specifically about the position of Lowe. So Lowe used to believe in WSP. So he provides two arguments. He has two arguments for different stuff. One of them is this argument, which is called the paring down argument. And the other one is this argument, which is called the simplicity argument, which he uses for another substance, just to prove the simplicity of something else. Then Lowe, near the end of his life, he gets convinced by some other arguments that WSP might be wrong. So what he does is that, he says that now I have to go back and repair this argument because this would stop working if you put aside WSP. And then he says, based on this work, he gets into anatomical parts. And there, when he gets to this point, now his brain is talking about the anatomy, and then he gets to this part, he doesn't sense any tension because he doesn't have WSP. So he says, for the anatomical part A, he still thinks that it's a composite, but he doesn't sense any tension here, so he just leaves it as it is. But I believe that if Lowe had come earlier to this thinking about the anatomy of the statue, and he hasn't put aside WSP, I guess the conclusion that he would have made is that A is not a composite, because this also aligns with his simplicity argument. So that's why I also will continue as if this is the best way to continue, that A is a simple thing. So why is it that it's counterintuitive? Because why is it that Lowe, it doesn't even occur to Lowe that, maybe you should say that A is not composite? Because what we say, let's just go to it. So what we're claiming here is that the clay statue A, which is a very simple anatomy of that statue, for example, just maybe a bridge of a nose or something, it's a simple substance. Simple in the sense that it doesn't have any proper part, constituted by Ca. You cannot break that apart anymore. Now this sounds strange because we think, it's a clay, right? I can split it. So first of all, it's not completely strange to talk about simple entities in metaphysics. So simple entity basically means an entity that doesn't have any proper part. You cannot break it apart anymore. Now we might not have such a thing in physics, or we might have actually. If you go to particle physics, you go really deep down, that you might get to some entities, maybe like electrons or quarks or something, that you just cannot break them apart anymore. They're just simple. But in philosophy, it's much easier to talk about simples. So our claim is that clay statue A is a simple substance constituted by Ca. We'll say, but we call A clay statue. We say it's made of clay. So how can we say that it's simple? that doesn't have any parts if it's a clay statue. But the idea is that we say that it's clay statue because it is constituted by clay. So the reason that we say it's a clay statue, it doesn't mean that it has a part. We don't say that clay is a part of the statue. As we said, if we say that it's a proper part of that statue, then that statue has to have a part, another proper part, distinct from the clay, but it doesn't have such a thing. And by too close, what I mean in the parentheses is the relation between constitution and identity. We have to keep a certain distance between constitution and identity. If we bring them too close to each other, we get confused because we think that they're identical. And there we might say, okay, but I can get a piece of it. How can you say that a statue that's made of clay, like I can see the grains in it, and then you say it's a simple thing, you cannot break it apart anymore? That's when we that's when we bring constitution identity too close to each other, in the sense that we think that they're the same thing, that there's not two items, but there's one item that we're talking about. And if you take them too far apart, then we'll also get into problems. So this is, for instance, a problem that I believe is when we bring them too close to each other. We might say that, okay, if A doesn't have any clay part, then it's not a physical thing. If there is no part of that statue A, and note that here I'm talking about the simple part A, if that doesn't have any clay part, it's not a physical thing. Some might claim like this. If you're claiming that clay is not a proper part of that simple and anatomical part A, then it's not a physical thing. But that's a problem because, again, this is taking the constitution identity too far from each other. Remember, the constitution is a relation in that X, in virtue of being constituted, gets some properties from Y. So A, that statue, that simple statue, gains its physical properties by virtue of being constituted by CA. So it's still a physical thing, physical in the sense that it has a location, it has a weight, it has those physical properties. It's a physical thing, it has physical properties. But it gets those physical properties from the lump of clay that is constituting it by virtue of being constituted by it. So if we pull them too far apart, we might come close to a kind of Cartesian dualism, as if they're two completely separate things. No. So one might still push, like, look, I can remove bits of this statue. Like, how can you say that this simple statue, that this statue is a simple entity, like it doesn't have any proper parts? I can just pull out a proper part out of it. How can you say that? Again, we have to say that those bits that you pull apart, they are part of the clay, of the CA that's constituting A. They're not parts of A. So since CA constitutes A, this common usage is understandable. See, so when we say that, hey, you remove the part of the statue. You might say that, right? You remove the part of the statue. But what we actually want to say is, you removed part of the clay that constitutes that statue, right? That's exactly what we want to say. You want to say that you didn't remove part of the clay, part of the statue. You removed part of the clay that constituted the statue. But again, because the constitution identity, they gain properties by virtue of each other, sometimes in our language we just say, in the same sense that sometimes we say that clay is a statue, but by is we don't mean identity is, we mean constitution is, because they're very close to each other. Here's also the same thing. So when we say that I removed a part of the A, what I mean that I removed part of the clay that constituted A. Someone might say, okay, if this A is a simple statue, and that lump of clay has no role to play in its mereology, because it's a simple thing, right? So the proper parts, that clay is not a part of that A, improper or proper. Proper parts of that clay are not parts of A. So if there is such a disconnect between them, then why is A is connected to this lump of clay at all? This is, again, pushing away too far constitutional identity and getting to that kind of problem of Cartesian dualism, that if these two things are so different from each other, so different, then why are they together? But that's not the point. We shouldn't push them far away. A is connected to CA because CA constituted A. And why is that? Because it is exactly the shaping of CA that brings A into existence. That's the connection. So the reason that you have A and CA in the same place, but at the same time there is no composition relation between A and the clay, in a sense that A is a simple entity. The relation is because it's exactly the shaping of that lump of clay that brings A into existence. And it's because of that lump of clay constitutes that statue. That's the connection. So we have to make sure that we're not pushing too far. So I believe that's the correct understanding of what's going on here, and I believe we can defend it against these sort of objections. And I believe the other ways of dealing with this sort of problem is not a good way. And so now we have basically all different sorts of ontological relations: identity, instantiation, characterization, exemplification, constitution, composition, and dependence. We covered them all, and now we can move on to the next lecture, which would be on persons as a psychological substance.